All right. Thank you for a great introduction. And it's great to see such a diversity of people here, especially the 14 other autistic individuals who have come to join me today. So let's do a nice screen share and we'll get the show on the road. And here we are ready to go. So what we're going to look at today is what I call the four aids of autism. It's a way of looking at how we can promote fulfilling and productive lives and making that the rule rather than the exception for autistic individuals. So let us unlock the doors and take a look. So let us begin with getting into the mind of the autistic person with the game of what is the difference between the picture of the on the top and the picture on the bottom. So as you study these two pictures, you'll begin to notice a few differences. Maybe you'll notice that there's a footer that's missing on the second pull on the bottom slide. On the bottom slide, second pull. The footer is missing. You keep looking and you might notice that the strap on the brown horse near the zebra is blue on the bottom and it's red on the top. There's about 10 more to go. Maybe some of you will notice a piece of paper or a quarter or on, on the bottom picture on the floor on the lower left, but not on the top. And there are some other differences as well. So just to make sure you get them all, here they are. So now it's time for a quiz. And what's it a picture of? Most of you will remember it as a merry-go-round or a carousel. What animal is in the foreground? Some people may remember it as a horse, but actually it's a zebra. And the questions 3 and 4, the color of the animal behind the first one, how many animals are in the row closest to us, that becomes a little more difficult. But I believe in errorless learning and everybody should do well and get an A. So here's the picture again, and you can get them all. So why did I do this? And why in particular might it have been difficult for many people to answer these questions? It was because I forced you to look at these pictures like us autistic people perceive the environment. We tend to focus on detail, often at the expense of the whole. So as a result of focusing on these details, it may be more difficult to answer, you might say, the big picture questions. And often this detail-oriented thinking is pathologized into being defined as a deficit in central coherence. However, as we consider detail-oriented thinking, what are some situations where you do want someone to be really detail-oriented? How about the pilot of the airplane that you're flying on, as the pilot does the walkabout, just checking to make sure everything on the outside of the airplane is working and looks good. It's not leaking gas or anything like that. What about being an accountant? You want someone who's counting your money to be very detail oriented. And often we look to IT as well, computer programming, detail oriented thinking. So it might be possible to say that if we put a typical non-autistic or allistic person in one of these situations, that they have a deficit in detail oriented thinking. And what this suggests is that we can take what is so commonly considered as deficits, disabilities, or disorders in autism, and flip them around and use them as strengths. So often people ask me about how to determine how can the autistic person I'm supporting, or many autistic people come to me, how can I find out what I'm good at? And my first question to that question is, how do you spend most of your time? How do they spend most of their time? If you would let them do it. And those areas that we like to spend time on, we tend to be good at, those can be matched to vocational or avocational possibilities. So the questions are, what are the abilities of the individual? What about the interests? What kind of mind does the person have? And often when people think of autistic uh, processing, you might say, they think that we're all visual. And I think many of us are, maybe even most of us autistic people, but that key word is many or most, not all. But what we can say is that wherever we tend to focus on, it tends to be an extreme. And that's a characteristic of autism that's not often considered. One way to think of autism is that it's a study of extremes, which means the things we're good at, we're incredibly good at. The things we're not so good at, well, perhaps we need a lot of support, and often there isn't that much in the middle. So that brings to mind a colleague of mine, Dina Gasner. She's very open with this, so I can mention her name. Has just graduated with a doctorate in social work at Adelphi University, where I teach. We've known each other for maybe 25 years, maybe even more. It took me 3 years to convince her she could do a doctoral degree. She applied, got in. Anyways, she got all A's in her courses except for quantitative research and statistics. She and numbers just don't get along. Uh, she's learned a long time ago not to even consider having a checkbook. But somehow she was able to complete all of her doctoral coursework with a distinction. And recently she's accepted a position as a senior research scientist at Drexel University, which is a Research One university. So some amazing abilities, but yes, some significant challenges as well. So what that suggests is that we need to reframe how we think about autism, turning away from the definition of deficits in communication, social interaction, restricted interests, sensory issues, and so on, and change that D word perhaps to differences. And what that does is allow us to change our language from thinking of autism, and we can extend this to people who are neurodivergent, as being as from defaulting to deficit, disorder, and disability, and considering the abilities and asking the question, what can that person do? And then taking it from the strengths and from the abilities to lead to fulfilling and productive lives, which is what the 4A's of autism are all about. So let us begin with that first A, which is awareness, something that we've been at for over a couple of generations. So back when I was diagnosed, back when I was in school, autism was considered to be this rare psychiatric condition caused by poor parenting, with a prevalence rate of 1 in 10,000, a very rare condition. Well, today we know a lot more, and we know that no, parents can't be blamed for their autistic child, unless you want to consider possibly passing on some genetic material, which nobody can do anything about. And we're now much better as a society at recognizing autism at home, in school, in the community, employment, and increasing numbers of autistic individuals reading about autism and saying, well, gee whiz, I think this is me. And then getting that verified through more formal procedures. And all this awareness is great because it serves as a solid foundation for the next step, which is acceptance. And acceptance means working with autism. It's when we turn away from looking at autism as a series of disorder, deficits, and disabilities and wanting to change autistic people, perhaps making autistic people more like non-autistic people, and recognizing that the best we could do with that approach is having one of us autistic people be a poor imitation of an allistic or non-autistic person. So an example of acceptance, let us say we're in a school situation, we have a child, a student who's not is not motivated to do math. Maybe they're not very good at it. They're not interested. And often what will happen is they'll take a look, well, what is this student's interests, their focus? And sometimes this is confused with a strength-based approach. And what they'll find is those areas of strengths, those areas of interest, and maybe uh, the strongest interest for this child is using a computerized flight simulator. And this child goes home every day, spends hours on this computerized flight simulator, and would even miss dinner if that child's parents didn't call them down for dinner. Maybe that's all they talk about when they're in school too. So school has become a non-flight simulator discussion zone. However, that's working against the characteristics of autism, and in this case, the highly focused interests that we have. And the educator who is working with autism, who's accepting these characteristics, is the one who finds a way to teach mathematics through using that flight simulator. There's plenty of mathematics involved in flying airplanes. And now mathematics will become intrinsically reinforcing because it involves that person's highly focused interest. And then perhaps one day that person figures out that they'll be even better at using that flight simulator by understanding mathematics. And that leads us to the next step, which is appreciation, where autistic people are valued and appreciated for whom we are, for what we can contribute to society. We first started seeing this in large IT companies, actively seeking autistic individuals because they know that a certain number of us can engage in computerized geekery at levels that nobody else can. And that's all well and good. And there are some of us who can do that. However, my question always is, well, what about everybody else? What about those of us who have skills in other areas? What about those of us who perhaps need more support in communication, social interaction, transportation, and various other aspects of life? And we'll take a look at how we can support individuals throughout the autism spectrum as we go on. And then finally, there's action. That's the fourth step. And action represents all the efforts that we put in to making those three first A's work. Oh, my charge to you is what actions are you going to take to climb these stairs of awareness, acceptance, and appreciation of autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people in your lives? And for the 14 who are in the audience, at least that's what it showed up in the poll, who are autistic, what actions will you take to climb these stairs for yourself? So moving along, what brings me here to talk about autism to you? Things were pretty typical at first. At 24 hours of age, my wife says I looked like an egg. And then at 18 months, like what happens to about 30% of us autistic people, I was struck with the regressive autism bomb, where I lost functional communication, had meltdowns, withdrew from the environment, and in brief, I became a very autistic little kid. There was so little known about autism in those days. So little known that it took my parents a year to find a place for diagnosis. My parents and everybody else were questioning, where did this autism come from? What do we do about it? Although now, with greater awareness, acceptance, and appreciation, I hear people more asking the question, what can we do with autism? So it was after that year they found a place to get a diagnosis. Those of you who have been in the Boston area for a long time may remember the James Jackson Putnam Children's Center. That's where I was diagnosed. And the doctor said, well, we've never seen such a sick child. And they recommended institutionalization. Well, fortunately, my parents, like we see ever increasing numbers of parents around the world, they advocated on my behalf and they convinced the school to take me in about a year. And it was during that year my parents implemented what we would today term as an intensive home-based early intervention program. And it was a program emphasizing music, movement, sensory integration, narration, imitation. And it probably looked like one of the more developmental, cognitive, or relational approaches that we have today, more child-centered in nature, maybe like the Miller method, or floor time, or relational development intervention is what my parents did. And with the work that my parents did, speech began to return at age 4. So what did they do? Well, their initial attempts to get me to imitate them failed. And imitation is a time-honored educational strategy. Everybody uses it, whether formally you're a teacher or not. You show someone how to do something, and then they do it. But perhaps due to a difference in mirror neurons, it didn't work for me. So my parents flipped it around and imitated me. And once they did that, I became aware of them in my environment, and then they were able to move me along. And I believe the key implication is that in order to do meaningful work with an autistic person, you have to first connect with, make that connection, meet that person where they are, and then develop a trusting relationship. And I find the people who are best being with autistic people do that, either instinctually or somewhere that was learned. And I think this holds true for everybody else as well, whatever level of education that you're working with. So I believe that we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have the ability that we can turn away from the closed doors of deficit disorder and disability to the open doors of ability. And rather than autism being a bomb, autism becomes, you might say, da bomb. And autism becomes da bomb when you focus on the abilities, the strengths. So let's take a look at someone like Victor, someone who might have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome some time ago, now considered as being autistic, needing supports at level 1. And as a young adult, he provides transportation system information to lost patrons at a very busy train station, South Station to be specific. And as we consider the characteristics of autism, instead of the deficit model of deficits in communication, social interaction, and so on, let's take a look at these differences. And how do these characteristics, what implications do they have for employment for this individual? Well, those of us who communicate through spoken word, we do tend to be detailed, factual, data-driven, truthful, repetitive. I think you get the idea. Well, how many times have you asked someone to repeat directions when you're lost? Well, that works. As we consider social interaction, well, this is a pretty predictable job. People go up to him, ask Victor, how do I get from one place to another? He tells them, they say, thank you very much. And they leave, and people understand what Victor needs in order to be successful. And where does he get this information? And I think we need to reframe restricted interests as deep interests or focused interests. And as a result of his interest in trains and transportation system information, he's memorized all of this. And as a result, he can access this information much faster than his coworkers who have to look it up in a reference. And because Victor is autistic, he outperforms his typical coworkers. Well, that's all well and good for people who need support at level 1, who can get along and get from one place to another and move around fairly independently, a lot of people say. Well, what about people who need more support? And so then we take a look at someone like Mary, who works in stockroom management at Walgreens Pharmacy. And her job is to receive items from shipping and match that item number to the same number that's on a shelf and place it on the shelf. So again, those characteristics, differences in communication, social interaction, restricted interests, or passions, rephrased as passions. What implications does this have for her employment? Well, Mary doesn't speak. Well, not very much anyways, perhaps a few words. She communicates by pointing at pictures on an iPad. And that works for her. And you don't need to speak very much to place items, to match stock numbers and place items on a shelf. Social interaction. She enjoys people who understand her, and when interactions are predictable, this is another very predictable job. And we might say Mary's motto is everything has a place and everything in its place. Get the job done. And she makes sure the job is done. She does it with more enthusiasm, faster and better than anybody else. And because she has these autistic characteristics, she outperforms her typical coworkers. And this is how we need to take a look at autism, and actually everybody else as well. So here I am at age 4. I entered the school that initially rejected me, the James Jackson Putnam Children's Center. I get reevaluated. Instead of being considered a psychotic and ready for an institution, I got upgraded to neurotic. So things are moving up in the world. I discovered the wonderful world of watch motors. I was found by my parents taking apart a watch with a knife. I'd pop open the back, extract the motor, remove the gears, spin them around, and then put it all back together again. The watch still worked, and there weren't any pieces left over. Well, my parents, upon noticing this, turned away from the closed doors of deficit disorder and disability and focused on the open doors of ability, and soon provided all kinds of other devices to take apart, and they made sure that I got them back together again. So I enjoyed doing this, taking apart watches. It does bring up a question, though, and that is, how could I have the fine motor control, those small body movements that help you zip up your coat zipper, to button your shirt, to tie your shoes, various other small tasks? How could I have an abundance of fine motor control to take apart a watch? And then where did that motor control go when it came to penmanship? That was a complete flop when it came to handwriting. Some of my worst memories in school, other than bullying, would be to walk into a room with a paragraph on the board. Because what that meant to us students is that we're probably going to have to copy it down. And it would take me all period to copy those words down, just a few, and everybody else had gone to recess. So I was a slow writer. But now we know a lot more about helping people do their writing, and without, you know, those of us who have difficulty with the physical act of penmanship. So I'll refer you to your favorite occupational therapist for some interesting neurological reasons why this might be the case. One task requiring fine motor control works well, whereas the other doesn't. What this is also an example of is the often fine lines of demarcation between the abilities that come with being autistic and the very real disabilities that can come with being on the autism spectrum. Let's take a look at Greg, the ball thrower. Now, with Greg, he's an elementary school non-speaking autistic child. He loves balls. If he sees a ball anywhere, he just takes it and throws it. That's just what he does. You try to take it away from him, you get a catastrophic meltdown. It only happens with these favorite objects, balls. It's written in his educational plan that all balls be kept out of sight, but his teachers aren't always successful in doing so. As a result, Greg's behavior is considered one of the school's most difficult students. So why is Greg doing this? What can we do to work with Greg? Is there a way to have it so Greg can successfully be in the same room as this object? Is there a way that these this fascination with this object are used to increase social interaction. So commonly what I would see would happen is that a work plan or a behavioral plan would be set up where there's a task that needs to be done, you take a break, you get access to this favorite object, balls, play with them. Now it's time to put them away and go back to work. And that would work exactly for one cycle. And that was it. Well, perhaps there's an alternative way. And that goes to those 4 A's of autism, accepting the characteristic of being highly involved with a particular object. In this case, it's these balls. And maybe what I would do is borrow a strategy from the Miller method. And that would be to walk into the room with a big box or bag of balls, big ones, little ones, different colors, different materials. And the first thing I would do is I'd go to Greg and say, here, and give it to him. And what would he do? He grabs it and throws it. That's what he does. Let's keep doing that until I build up a system or a routine. And what I'm doing is I'm meeting Greg where he is. I'm establishing a relationship. And maybe we can expand from that, such as having him go to open up a box and take out a ball and then throw it. Maybe shape that to throwing it in a basket, precursors of basketball. Maybe there's a second person in the room who also has a ball that Greg can go to. And in this way, instead of being the taker awayer of his favorite activity, I am now the provider of this activity. And then we can begin work on teaching Greg to count, categorize, or whatever else that he needs to be taught. So it's developing that relationship and interacting with the object as opposed to taking the object away and interacting in spite of the object. So it's a different way of looking at things. So here I am at age 6. Speech had pretty much returned. I entered regular school kindergarten. I was a social and academic catastrophe. You know what happens to people who are different in grade school? Well, there was a lot of bullying. Fortunately, school systems realize that bullying is not a developmental phase that people need to go through, and something is being done about it. Grade-wise, I was about a grade behind in most of my subjects, and I would spend most of my time getting books on my favorite subjects from the library, reading them, taking notes, copying diagrams, and sometimes even wondering, is there more to school than just reading books on my favorite subjects, like doing math in groups? But I just kept reading my books. And I think they called that some sort of inclusion. There I was in the back of the room, reading my books in the same room, geographically included. And that's actually what I call it when you have one of us who's in the same classroom as everybody else, but uh, we're not doing anything that is related to what is happening in class. I guess saying the letter B over and over again didn't endear me to my classmates either. But fortunately, we now know a lot more about supporting students, uh, both autistic students and non-autistic students, to learn more about each other and getting along with each other. When does transition to adulthood begin? And this is the federally mandated transition age. Many school systems are still at 14 because that's what it used to be before it was changed up to 16. However, I think that's way too late. I've always been mystified as to who thought it was a good idea to just start thinking about what a person's going to do with the remaining 70% of their lives, and giving only 2 years to do that. whereas we really should be thinking about transition to adulthood as early as 6, maybe even earlier than that. So, for example, when I was taking apart watches, maybe it looked like I could have been a watchmaker. I would have been needed a lot of support in all other aspects of adult life, but at least this was something I could do and be happy doing it and being good at it. As it turned out, I ended up doing different other things. Uh, However, it is good to be keep track and follow the interests and the abilities of an individual, and I would say autistic or otherwise, for potential implications later on in life. I remember in 3rd grade, cracking open small rocks with a big rock. I was fascinated by the shiny specks inside, the sharp edges. That eventually grew into special interests in geology, geography. Then there was astronomy. Then there was weather, music, electricity, dinosaurs, earthquakes, volcanoes. Many different interests that would come and go. I remember about this time I had a stack of astronomy books on my desk, and the teacher told me that I'd never learn how to do math. But somehow I figured out just enough math to teach statistics at the university level. And today, I'm encouraged that increasing numbers of educators would notice a special interest like this and find a way, for example, to teach mathematics through astronomy. So as we think about those highly focused interests, which if we take a deficit model, it's something that interferes with daily functioning because it gets in the way. These are some of my highly focused interests. They come and they go. Sometimes it's more than one of them at a time. Make sure you get them all because there will be a quiz at the end. Every autistic person I know who is successful has found a way to parlay something they're interested in into something that society values. And that often translates into some sort of employment. Age 10. I was awfully concerned about the letter E because I heard you have to drop E before adding ing. Well, wasn't that E going to get hurt when it fell to the ground? I had a friend who said he felt like a pizza. He didn't look like one, he didn't smell like one. So that was an issue. I also remember about this time our class being interrupted by an announcement. The principal had lost his mother. So that made me think about what my parents would tell me when I lost something. Well, it was in the last place you left it, they would say, which I always thought was a silly answer because if I knew that, I wouldn't ask them. So I thought I could be helpful to the principal if I suggested that if he thought real hard as to where he last saw his mother, he might just find her. Well, that didn't go well at all. So what does that mean, mother? He lost his mother. Well, his mother passed away. Well, that's another idiom. Finally, we get to his mother died. And if somebody had just told me directly instead of using an idiom, I would have been much more appropriate. We have difficulty perceiving idioms because we tend to think literally. Research suggests that 93% or up to 93% of interaction is nonverbal. And for us autistic people who often have a difficult time perceiving and decoding nonverbal communication, we may be left with just as little as 7% of the communication package. And that's not very much. So we have to think literally. So that brings us to the hidden curriculum, which is something we can learn. Good news is that we can learn it, but it requires direct instruction. And it often doesn't appear to us until we've broken a rule. So, knowing, for example, how do you behave when you're with your friends? versus when you're in school? What does lunch hour actually mean? Who takes a full hour for lunch anyways? But people still use that type of terminology. You ask one of us to hold the door, and this might be the impression that we get. You tell one of us that you'll get to our question in a minute, guess who is counting the seconds? So again, we can learn these figures of speech, but the key word is that we may need to be directly taught. So getting back to my situation, here I am in middle and high school. You don't need to be autistic to have difficulty in middle and high school. But for me, it was actually easier for a couple of good reasons. One is I figured out that using words instead of sound effects from the environment really helped with social interaction. Secondly, I was able to engage in my highly focused interest of music. I joined the band. Now I had a structured activity in which to mediate my interactions with others. And in fact, I got so tied up in music that I got it into my head I needed to learn how to play all the musical instruments, every last one of them. And there I was, hours in the instrument closet, taking instruments apart, reassembling them, sometimes combining multiple instruments into these horrific contraptions that never should have seen the light of day. And while I didn't get to learn all the instruments, I did get it up to about 15 different instruments. And then when I realized that a requirement for a degree in music education was you had to learn all the instruments, well, that just seemed to be the thing to do. And as a result, I now give music lessons to autistic children and adults. Because in addition to the therapeutic benefits of engaging in music, you're also teaching that person a real life skill in which to develop interactions with others as a musician. Also, music is just plain old fun. And then finally, I haven't figured out how to teach typical kids yet, so I just stick with the ones on the autism spectrum. For some reason, autistic people just make a lot more sense to me. So we've also talked about employment, and it's important to realize, well, sometimes an endeavor doesn't work out, and we have to change our strategies. So here's an example of my first job. Cleaning dishes in a noisy restaurant. Too much sensory input, sensory overload. It was a basket full of sensory violations. I knew I had to do something else. Too much social interaction as well. And so I thought about, what do I like to do? And by this time, I was also interested in bicycles. And I'd gotten it to a point where I could take a bicycle apart down to the ball bearings and get that back together again, just like watches. So what about fixing bicycles in a bicycle shop? Well, I got onto my bicycle that I built from the ground up, made the rounds of all the bicycle shops in the area. I'd find the manager of the shop and nerd into my bicycle with the manager as only a bicycle geek could. And then after a period of time, I'd ask him for a job. It took about 12 times. And that finally, on that 12th time, I was able to turn away from the closed door of what didn't work, noisy restaurant, to an open door of what did work, where I could mediate my sensory input by working in the back of the shop fixing bicycles, or I could come to the front of the shop and perseverate on bicycles to whoever walked in. And I think the manager referred to that as fixing bicycles. Later on in college, this became a great way to earn money. Instead of doing a typical job, I plastered the campus, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst to be specific, with signs just like that. And with these signs, I soon had my dorm room full of bicycles that needed to be fixed. I could spend half a day or a whole day fixing bicycles and earn more money than I could in a month working one of those typical boring work study jobs. all of us need to work for a living, or most of us do. And what is important is to consider the person's characteristics. What do they do? What do they like to do? How can that be translated into a possible position? Unusual sensory stimulation, for example. I remember I was at a conference in Japan, and a mother asked me what could her autistic uh, teenager, who didn't speak very much, he needed a good amount of support, could do for a job. So I asked, what does he like? And he had this weird uh, interest where he'd go into the basement, he'd turn on a water faucet, stick his thumb under it, and spray water all around. So I don't know why he did this. It might have been sensory in nature. Maybe he likes the sound of the water spraying all over the place, the feel against his thumb, whatever it is. But what we do know is that he likes to spray water at high pressure. So what does that translate to employment wise? Well, maybe he could be a fireman. But then again, to be a fireman, you have to have really good communication skills, uh, spoken communication skills, which he didn't have at that time. So maybe that wasn't the best choice. But what other opportunities are there for spraying water at high pressure? Maybe working in a car wash, cleaning sidewalks, power washing buildings, maybe watering plants. So these are things that I would consider for him insofar as looking for employment. Possibly even finding a friendly firehouse and helping the firefighters wash their fire engines after they finish fighting a fire. So these might be some options. Well, off to college. College was a utopia, studying music education, had more friends, no more bullies. Uh, if I want to ride my bicycle at midnight, I can find someone just as strange as I was to also ride at midnight. Dating often occurs in college. That was something that was confusing to me. It's confusing to a lot of people, autistic or otherwise. And I remember um, after spending a lot of time with this lady on undergraduate school, she told me that she really likes hugs and back rubs. And my thought was, well, gee, I've got this brand new friend and she doubles as a source of deep pressure, like a temple grandin squeeze machine. Well, I guess she had other ideas, but I wasn't interested in a girlfriend at that time. But what this did tell me is that there was this whole area of communication that, as I mentioned before, called nonverbal. So guess what became the next interest? Hours reading books on body language, um, relationships, dating for dummies, and so on. And then we move on to graduate school, pretty local here at Boston University, uh, still as a music student. And initially, I met this lady reviewing each other's homeworks, then doing things socially. And then one day at a beach very much like this, she suddenly gave me a kiss, a hug, and held my hand. And now I had the social story down. And it went something like this. If a woman hugs you, kisses you, and holds your hand all at about the same time, she probably wants to be a girlfriend. And if that's the case, you better have an answer right away. And it could either be yes, it could be no, or it could be further investigation and analysis as indicated. Well, it seemed to be a good thing to do. And we've now been married for um, over 35 years. And if you want to find out more about what life is like on her side of the spectrum, I encourage you to read my book, her contributions to my autobiography, Beyond the Wall. And as of today, I now spend most of my time in a sheltered workshop for autistic people who are at level 1, where we perseverate on topics for years, sometimes lifetimes. We talk about them incessantly, even if people don't want to listen. Sometimes social interaction between community members could be improved. And as we think back to those diagnosing professionals at the James Jackson Putnam Children's Center who recommended I be in an institution, I guess in some ways they were right. But what they perhaps didn't take into account is that it would be an institution of higher education as a professor of special education at Adelphi University in New York. So as we close out today's webinar, my question is, do we continue to consider autism as a series of deficits, disorder, and disability, or is it a particular set of abilities? What are we going to do to take those 4 A's of autism: awareness, acceptance, appreciation, followed by action, to promote fulfilling and productive lives? And to get you started thinking, I've taken some commonly cited challenges of autistic people, and what can we do instead of looking at them as deficits? How can they be considered as strengths, both as in youth, perhaps as a student, and later on as an adult? All of us autistic people grow up to be adults, and eventually we become senior citizens too. And how do we use those strengths in order to lead fulfilling and productive lives? So as we close out today's seminar, I think it's good to take a look at success. And what is success? And I believe if you have someone who's productive and fulfilled with their lives, they're probably successful, whatever that may be. And it's according to the individual. As we go through our journey in life, from goal to goal, from activity to activity. And I believe we have success if we can get through an experience, whether it's as an autistic person, exploring career opportunities, learning something new in class, making new friends, whatever it is we're interested in. If we go through that experience and we learn even one thing more about being successful in our interactions with the environment, then that's success, and that you're exactly where you need to be. As we all continue to learn more about autism, learning more about working with autism and working with the characteristics to promote fulfilling and productive lives as the rule rather than the exception. So I want to thank everybody here for all you do in promoting fulfilling and productive lives for us autistic individuals. And I think now it's time for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shore. This was really special to hear you share your story. And that's what I'm seeing from folks in the comments as well, just sort of echoing that same sentiment. So yes, we'll just jump right in with questions. We have a few minutes, so I don't want to waste any more with my chatting. So so starting off, interesting question that came in was just someone surprised by the age in which you suggest to prepare for adulthood being 6 years old. Do you have any insight on what maybe other people in an individual's life, so say that 6-year-old with autism's life, should be looking out for to help prepare them for adulthood, whether it's their parents, teachers, healthcare providers?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's important to be looking at what that person is interested in. What is the focus? How do they spend most of their time? And whatever that is, it's possible it might lead directly to a hobby later on, or perhaps employment. Taking apart watches, or things could have gone in that direction. Well, later on, repairing bicycles, had my trajectory gone in that direction instead of academics and being a professor. Sometimes the interest serves as a launch pad. So you have someone who's fascinated with, say, Thomas the Tank Engine, and that's all they want to talk about. If you stick with Thomas the Tank Engine, specifically, maybe you won't go that far. But if we can use it as a launch pad, where do trains go? Where do we find trains? What are trains like in other countries? What are the similarities? What are the differences? What do they carry? How do trains work? How do trains get designed? And in that way, you start opening up many possibilities based on a particular interest.
Great, thank you. And you shared a little bit about different potential career paths and different jobs that you've had before you landed as an educator. But what advice do you have for potential employers that can help them support and appreciate individuals with autism?
Learn about autism. And to that end, I think uh, about the Qatar Foundation in the state of Qatar. They asked a colleague and I to develop a 40-hour train the trainer curriculum on employing autistic and otherwise neurodiverse individuals in their country. And I was very encouraged that they reached out and want to learn about this, about learning how to employ people who are autistic. And so what that means is that companies um, should reach out to autistic and others who are experts in this area to find out more about the benefits of hiring autistic people. Because as we look at the characteristics of autism, and again, we flip them around and can look at them as strengths, adherence to routines, affinity for routines. I've yet to meet an employer who doesn't like it when their employee shows up to work on time every single day and makes sure the job gets done on time every time.
Great. And then I think something on the, I guess on the flip side of that, but staying in the employment, on the employment topic, um, how do you suggest, discussing or choosing not to discuss with your employer or disclosing that you have autism with an employer? How has that, how have you approached that in the past, or do you have any suggestions on what, if that's necessary or you feel it's necessary?
Yeah, I do. So let's take an example. Many people, maybe even those of you in webinar land, may think of this hat as a fashion statement. And certainly it's always good to support my university, Adelphi University, whenever possible. However, I am known for wearing this hat. And while it is a fashion statement, I suppose, its primary use is accommodation. And because for me, being under recessed lighting fixtures is probably like looking into a spotlight for most other people. So what implications does that have in potential advocacy, which is a whole other webinar that we could do at a future date. So let us suppose my supervisor is showing me a workspace and it's lit with recessed lighting fixtures, which they and I don't get along. It's something that I'm aware of. It's something that I've noticed. And once I notice that, I turn to my supervisor and say, well, I noticed that nobody here is wearing a hat. I wonder if it's okay if I wear my hat. That is the advocacy piece, done in a simple manner in a way that the supervisor can understand and provide support. And then you talked about disclosure. So why am I asking for an accommodation or greater understanding? And the reason why I need to wear this hat is because these lights are very bright to me. They hurt my eyes. I could be much more productive in your office if I could wear this hat. And what I did was what is known as a partial disclosure. I focused only on the aspect of autism, the specific aspect that is causing a challenge at this time. It wouldn't be appropriate to do a full-blown disclosure and presentation on autism, kind of like what I did here, because it would be distracting and there isn't enough time to do that. There are other times when it is important to do a full disclosure. And each situation is going to be different. And I think when disclosing, and the only reason, most of the time when you disclose, it's because you have to advocate for something. It's important for that autistic person or the person advocating for the autistic individual to be able to state what the challenge is. How can this challenge be resolved in a reasonable fashion? So an unreasonable request would be to shut off all the lights because they're too bright, because it would affect everybody else in the office. So what is a reasonable accommodation, and what can you do to self-accommodate as needed? And that could be, other examples could be needing to move away from a noisy copy machine, or where there's too much foot traffic, to be able to work in a quieter place. That might be the autistic person asking for directions to, to complete a job or to run a machine to be written as opposed to verbal, because that person does much better when they have directions to refer to. So it's a question of partial and full disclosures.